There are places so deep in the wild that sound itself seems to vanish. From a snow-covered trail where hunters uncover a massive woven nest near the border woods to a patrol found miles off course, barefoot with their boots arranged in perfect order, every clue points to intent, not coincidence. In this video, we'll explore 6 disturbing encounters that hint at an unseen intelligence moving through the wilderness beyond our reach. On March 18, 2024, deep in the northern forests near the Canadian border, Jake Holbrook and Tom Garrison began tracking what they believed to be a record-sized black bear. Both men had hunted for years and knew the region better than anyone in their small mountain town. Jake, 43, worked as a logging foreman, while Tom, 46, managed a local outfitting shop that guided seasonal hunts. The morning air carried frost, the kind that snapped underfoot and left a thin mist floating above the low shrubs. The trail they followed stretched over uneven ground, where the snow had begun to melt into slush, leaving deep impressions in the soil. Each print measured close to 15 inches, wide at the heel, narrowing near the front. They assumed at first it belonged to an enormous bear newly out of hibernation, ranging across the thawing ground before the full spring green-up. As they moved deeper, something about the path unsettled them. The spacing between each print was unusually long, more like strides than steps. The forest felt muted. The normal sound of chickadees and squirrels was gone. Even the wind seemed trapped high above the canopy. A faint vibration hummed through the ground, too steady to be thunder, almost like slow breathing far below the surface. The deeper they went, the stronger it became. Tom stopped once to check the compass, but the needle twitched slightly, refusing to hold a clear direction. The two exchanged uncertain glances but pressed on, believing they were close to their quarry. The prints led through a thicket of spruce into a low valley where the air grew warmer and thick with a sour metallic scent. Ahead, a break in the trees revealed a strange shape rising from the snow. At first, it looked like storm debris or a tangle of fallen trunks, but as they neared, both men froze. The shape formed a dome nearly 10 feet high, built from heavy branches bent and twisted together in an unnatural weave. Mud and pine sap coated the outer layer, giving it a dull, wet sheen that reflected the pale light filtering through the clouds. The clearing itself was perfectly round, its edges marked by scattered bones. Inside, piles of moss lay flattened, matted with clumps of coarse black hair that glistened with grease. Small animal skulls lined the inner wall, all facing inward, arranged in rows as if watching something that had once rested there. The smell was overpowering, thick with decay and the sharp sweetness of rot. Jake stepped forward, hand over his face, trying not to breathe. The hum beneath their feet seemed louder now, pulsing through the ground in uneven bursts. From somewhere beyond the tree line came a low sound, an exhale, long and wet, echoing through the trunks. The trees groaned as if bending under sudden weight. A heavy shape moved between the shadows, slow and deliberate. Both men felt the air change, pressure thickening around them. The forest held its breath as branches cracked behind the dome, each snap closer than the last. The crash of branches behind the dome broke into a pattern of rhythm, each sound heavier than the last. The two hunters turned as one and ran, crashing through brush that tore at their clothes. The hum beneath their boots grew sharper, vibrating through the frozen ground with each stride. The forest no longer seemed familiar. Shapes of trees blended with shadows that swayed against the pale light above. The sound of air moving through vast lungs followed close behind, not fast but steady, as though whatever lurked there was keeping pace without effort. Every breath from the unseen thing rolled through the mist in a slow push of heat that clung to their backs like smoke. The smell grew stronger, a sickly blend of decay and damp fur, making it hard to breathe. The men did not stop until the first gray of morning stretched over the ridge. Their muscles shook, and frost had collected on their sleeves. Behind them, the forest had gone quiet again, as if the night had sealed itself away. When they reached the trailhead, they found the soil undisturbed. The prints they had followed the day before, erased as if swept clean. Not a single mark of their chase remained. Both knew they would never return, yet fear of disbelief kept them from speaking about what they had seen. 3 days later, a local ranger followed up after hearing about distant gunshots near the ridge. He found the same route they had taken, though now the landscape looked different. The clearing still opened between the trees, but the strange dome was gone. In its place stood a shallow depression filled with torn soil and crushed moss. Around the edge of that hollow, deep impressions sank into the mud, far wider than human tracks. They curved in a circle, as though something massive had turned slowly on the spot before vanishing into the forest. A few dark clumps of coarse hair clung to a broken pine branch. The air still carried the faint metallic scent that burned the nose and lingered in the mouth long after breathing it. When word reached the nearest town, hunters began avoiding the ridge entirely. No one could explain how a structure that large could disappear overnight, or how every trace of bone and sap had vanished. The ranger reported the findings, but listed the cause as unknown animal activity. The file was closed within the month. Those who lived nearby said that when the snow melted that spring, the earth along the ridge shifted, and the clearing appeared farther north than before. Travelers who camped nearby claimed to hear low breathing from beneath the ground, steady and deep, as though the forest itself had lungs. None stayed long enough to see if it came from above or below. On May 16, 2024, the dense woodland ridges of northern Montana sat under a pale dawn haze when Trevor Miles led 3 travelers up a steep trail. He was 45, a seasoned wilderness guide who had spent half his life working along the rugged ridgelines, teaching others how to move safely through the backcountry. The group he led consisted of Olivia Hart, a 32-year-old photographer from Oregon, Ben Carter, a former forest ranger now retired, and Paul Evans, a college student studying geology. Each had joined Trevor's guided expedition to capture rare views of the sunrise across the high basin. The climb was steady and quiet. Mist drifted low through the pines, and frost still clung to patches of moss where the ground dipped into shade. They set up camp that evening near a narrow stream that wound through the valley floor. Trevor taught them how to arrange the fire and secure their food away from the tents. The night was calm, the air heavy with the scent of pine sap and damp earth. They talked softly while smoke curled into the darkness. After checking his compass and marking the next day's route, Trevor turned in first. The others followed, lulled by the faint sound of water trickling over stone. At dawn, the first light came through gray clouds, and the fire pit glowed faintly from leftover embers. Olivia was the first to notice the empty sleeping mat near the camp edge. Trevor's gear lay where he had left it, except for his compass, which now stood upright beside the burned logs. The needle spun in endless circles, twitching as though drawn by unseen motion. They called his name into the fog, their voices muffled by thick air that seemed to absorb every sound. There were no footprints leading away from the tents, no torn brush or bent twigs showing a path. Ben moved toward the tree line, scanning the ground for clues when a sharp noise rolled through the valley. It was not a human call. It came low and ragged, stretched thin like a cry carried underwater. The sound rose and fell, twisting in pitch, echoing across the ridge until the forest swallowed it. Paul froze, staring toward the direction of the noise. Another wail followed closer, deep and broken, a voice that struggled to form words. They gathered their lights and started toward the sound, hearts pounding. The noise led them through thick undergrowth until the trees opened over a narrow drop. The edge of the ravine showed fresh soil torn loose along the roots. Every nearby trunk bore deep claw marks carved straight through the bark, reaching nearly 8 feet high. Below the ridge lay Trevor's empty pack, turned on its side. The zipper was open, but the food inside remained untouched. Instead, a handful of smooth river stones sat within, each marked by strange carved grooves that looked worn by human hands, though none of them could guess what they meant. The air around the ravine felt heavy and still, as if the forest held its breath. The 3 stood motionless, staring at the strange grooves cut into the smooth stones. Each line ran with an even depth, curling into patterns that seemed too exact to be random, yet too rough to be carved by tools. The surface of the rocks was damp with morning frost, but the marks inside were dry, as though etched long before dawn. Ben lifted one of the stones carefully and noticed the ground beneath the pack pressed down in a circle, as if something large had stood there for some time. The silence broke again with a faint rumble, not from above but from deep inside the gorge below. The sound rose and fell in uneven waves, like distant movement in water. They backed away slowly, scanning the ground for any sign of where their guide might have gone. There were no tracks near the pack, no crushed grass, no drag marks. Yet the clawed trunks surrounding them stood as clear proof that something immense had passed through the night before. The deep furrows reached far above arm's length, each fresh and filled with damp splinters. When they turned back toward camp, the forest seemed altered. The trail they had used earlier felt unfamiliar, as if the trees had shifted positions. Even the smell in the air carried a sour edge of decayed leaves, mixed with a faint metallic scent that burned in the throat. When they reached the clearing again, the fire had burned out completely, leaving only gray ash spread across the stones. The compass still stood beside the pit, its needle turning aimlessly. Around the camp, the soil was disturbed in wide arcs, as if something had moved in circles through the night, brushing against the tents but leaving no damage. The sense of being watched pressed from all directions, though the woods appeared empty. Without speaking, they gathered what little they could and began the descent. The low wails that had called them toward the ravine never returned, only the occasional shudder of wind slipping between branches. The forest stayed quiet until they reached the lower ridge where sunlight broke through thin clouds. Rescue teams arrived that evening after receiving a distress signal from Paul's emergency beacon. Search dogs refused to approach the upper ridge, whining and pulling away from the incline. When investigators examined the site, they found the same stones that had been in the pack laid out in a ring where the tents once stood. Each rested evenly spaced, forming a perfect circle nearly 6 feet wide. In the center lay a weathered hat with the name of the missing guide, stitched faintly along the inner band. The surrounding earth bore no footprints, only a smooth surface pressed flat as if by weight rather than steps. The search continued for days, but no trace of Trevor appeared. The sounds of the ridge were said to change after that. Locals claimed that at night faint cries rose from the trees, fading into the wind before anyone could tell if they belonged to a person or something else that moved just beyond the reach of light. On September 15, 2022, 2 experienced explorers named Mark and Lydia hiked deep into the backcountry of Idaho, far from any marked routes. They had planned a 3-day journey through thick forest land known for its narrow ridges and hidden streams. Mark, a 39-year-old field surveyor from Oregon, had spent years mapping remote terrain, while Lydia, age 35, worked as a wildlife photographer drawn to untouched wilderness. The weather that morning was cool and clear, sunlight filtering through pine branches that swayed gently above a winding gorge. The pair followed the sound of moving water, expecting to find a shallow crossing ahead, but what appeared between the trees stopped them in silence. Spanning the narrow gap over the gorge stood a wooden bridge, unlike anything they had seen in that part of the wild. The structure looked recently built, its planks smooth and stripped of bark, bound together by thick vines that wound through drilled holes like rope. The workmanship appeared careful and even, yet there was no sign of human activity nearby. No tire marks, no cut stumps, no broken path leading toward it. It stood as if placed there by unseen hands. The air felt oddly still around it, carrying a faint scent of damp wood and earth. Mark inspected one post with curiosity, tracing the clean edge of each cut. The surface was cold despite the afternoon heat. Lydia took photographs but soon lowered her camera, unsettled by the complete quiet that hung over the gorge. Even the water below seemed muted, moving without sound. They decided to make camp a few hundred feet from the strange structure before the light faded. By evening, the forest grew darker than usual, and the air thickened with a heavy calm. The fire burned steady at first, bright against the gloom, until the flames began to flicker for no reason. There was no wind, yet the fire wavered as if caught by invisible gusts. Mark adjusted the wood, but the flame kept shifting, bending sideways, then steadying again. Lydia glanced toward the direction of the gorge and felt the ground faintly tremble under her boots. Then came the creak, a slow, drawn-out sound of wood under pressure. It echoed softly at first, then again louder, as though something heavy had stepped onto the bridge. The rhythm was steady, one footfall after another, moving toward their camp at a measured pace. The night seemed to fold around each sound, amplifying it through the stillness. Neither spoke as the footsteps stopped suddenly, followed by complete silence. The forest waited. The air felt heavy, pressing down against their skin, and the faint smell of wet bark drifted from the gorge. Hours passed before the sounds faded completely, replaced by the quiet hiss of the dying fire. Neither slept. When dawn arrived, pale and cold, they walked back toward the gorge, anxious to see the bridge again. Morning light reached the gorge with a thin gray color, revealing a sight that made them stop in disbelief. The structure they had seen only the day before was gone. No remains of timber lay across the gap, only two wooden posts half sunk into wet ground on either side, tilted at odd angles as though pulled apart by tremendous force. The soil around the posts was torn and scattered, deep grooves showing where something heavy had been dragged away. Below, the river moved sluggishly, carrying faint ripples that spread from the center outward. Around the banks, the ground glistened with a thin layer of moisture, yet not a single plank floated downstream. It was as if the bridge had vanished without leaving a trace. When they stepped closer, the smell of decay filled the air, thick and sour. Beneath the place where the bridge once stood, the earth was littered with pale bones. Dozens of them, small and large, arranged with eerie precision in neat lines pointing toward the empty space above the gorge. The bones gleamed white and clean, polished smooth as though rubbed by countless hands. None belonged to a single type of creature. Some were narrow and curved, others heavy and flat, forming tidy rows along the damp mud. Every piece aimed toward the center where the bridge had hung hours earlier. The sight froze both travelers in silence. The arrangement looked too deliberate to be random, too careful to be made by wind or water. As they turned back toward camp, they noticed the forest floor had changed. The soil that had been untouched the day before now showed prints beside their own, larger and deeper, pressed clearly into the soft ground. The impressions were barefoot, with wide toes and long arches, the shape of each step marked perfectly in sequence. The strides stretched farther than any human could manage. They led from the direction of the gorge toward the trail, then vanished into a patch of ferns near their campsite. The faint odor that lingered there was the same musky scent from the night before, strong enough to sting the air. The fire pit had gone cold, and ashes had been swept into a pile, leaving the stones clean. Even their cooking pot had been placed upright, empty, next to the circle as though inspected. Fear silenced them for the rest of the hike back. Neither looked behind. The woods seemed to close in tighter with each passing mile, the sounds of birds and insects returning only when the gorge was far behind. When they reached the forest's edge, clouds gathered and a thin drizzle began to fall, washing the trail of any remaining prints. They told no one about the discovery. Their photographs remained undeveloped, stored away and never shown. In the months that followed, Lydia's sleep was filled with faint sounds echoing through her dreams. The slow creak of invisible steps moving across wood that should not exist, fading into darkness before dawn returned. On July 9th, 2024, deep inside the old-growth forest of Western Oregon, Ranger Emma Cortez began her seasonal duty at a tall fire lookout tower that stood above miles of pine and cedar. She was 34, steady and methodical, known for keeping precise field logs and never missing a radio call. The small structure was her post for the summer, a narrow cabin perched high on metal supports with a spiral staircase winding from the ground to the deck. Below stretched a dense wilderness where fog gathered thick after sundown. For the first 2 weeks, her notes stayed ordinary. Wind readings, cloud cover, deer sightings along the southern ridge. Each night she checked her lantern, recorded temperatures, and listened to the distant hum of insects through open windows. Nothing unusual disturbed her watch until the third week, when subtle noises began to rise from the dark timber below. At first it was faint movement in the brush, slow, heavy, measured, unlike the short scurry of a fox or elk. The sound came after midnight and lasted only minutes before fading into stillness. Emma marked it in her log with care, unsure if fatigue played tricks on her hearing. Yet each following night, the same pattern returned. The steps circled the tower, crunching softly through damp needles. They paused, then shifted direction as if the walker traced the perimeter again and again beneath her. Her hands trembled slightly as she wrote a single line in her notebook that morning. Something large circling the tower at night, breathing, heavy, not a bear. Days passed without daylight clues. Then, after a storm, she found marks in the mud near the base of the structure, broad impressions wider than any human boot, pressed deep and clean as though from bare skin. Each print faced the forest line, evenly spaced, fading into the undergrowth. She photographed them with her field camera, though nothing in her training could identify what had made them. The distance between steps suggested height far beyond her own. She measured one and recorded its size quietly in the margin of her notebook, before covering it with a plank to protect it from rain. That evening, clouds rolled low and the wind fell flat. The usual forest noise vanished, leaving a hollow quiet around the tower. When dusk turned to full dark, she felt a subtle vibration underfoot, faint but rising through the steel frame. She switched off her lantern to listen. The steps came again, closer than before, circling once, then stopping directly beneath. A long exhale drifted upward, rough and wet, carrying a smell of damp bark and earth. Metal groaned softly below her as something brushed the lower rungs of the stairs. Emma stayed still, heart hammering, pen frozen above her logbook. Hours crawled by before the night eased into gray light, and she finally dared to note one line across the page before sunrise. It climbed the stairs last night. When the next sunrise broke through the haze, Emma's tower stood motionless above the endless canopy. She had not slept. The metal beneath her boots still felt cold from the night before, holding faint vibrations that seemed to echo through the frame. Her flashlight lay on the floor beside her cot, its beam flickering weakly, drained of power though she had replaced the batteries only a day earlier. Down below, the ground looked freshly turned, patches of soil darker than before, as if something massive had pressed its weight there for hours. She wrote a final brief entry before sealing her logbook, her handwriting uneven from fatigue. That would be her last note. 2 days later, when a relief ranger arrived to deliver supplies, the tower door stood open against its hinges. The lock plate hung twisted, the screws pulled clean from the wood. The lantern had been knocked over but not broken. A faint scuff marked the metal steps halfway up, streaked with what looked like dried sap mixed with mud. On the floor inside, her flashlight still pulsed weakly, the light flickering against the walls as though someone had touched it recently. Her pack remained untouched in the corner, rations lined neatly beside her bedroll. But Emma herself was gone. Search teams reached the site that evening. No signs of a struggle appeared inside the small cabin, and nothing had been taken. Around the tower base, investigators found 2 distinct sets of tracks. One set matched her boots leading away toward the eastern trail. The other appeared 30 feet beyond the last of her steps, massive, spaced far apart. Each print sunk deep into moss and mud before fading where the forest floor hardened. They followed for a short distance before losing the trail entirely beneath the tangle of roots. The air along that path carried a strong, earthy odor, faintly sweet and metallic, which some described as the scent of wet stone after rain. Dogs brought to the area refused to go near the footprints, turning back with tails low and heads bowed. Her journal was locked in storage once the investigation ended. The official report listed her as missing, likely due to a fall or disorientation in rough terrain. The tower was cleaned and reassigned for the next season, but no one accepted the post for long. The ranger who replaced her lasted only 3 nights before refusing to stay past dusk. He claimed the forest changed as the sun dropped, the quiet growing too deep to bear. Each evening, just before full dark, A single sound echoed from below, a dull strike against the lowest metal stair, never more than once, always the same measured impact. After it came, the insect stopped, and the trees seemed to lean closer as if listening. The tower remains active but unoccupied at night. Locals say when the air turns heavy with mist, a faint beam still flickers from the top deck, though the power has long been cut, and no one is there to write in the log. On October 19, 2021, early morning mist hung low over a quiet lake deep within the Russian wilderness, its surface smooth as glass. Mikhail Ivanov, a 40-year-old fisherman from a nearby village, rowed out before dawn in his small wooden boat to check his lines. He had fished these waters his entire life, known for his patience and habit of working alone. The lake was far from any main road, surrounded by endless pine and birch that pressed close to the shore. The stillness that day carried a strange weight. No wind touched the water, and even the birds stayed hidden. Mikhail set his oars aside, adjusting his net while fog drifted across the surface in thin gray waves. He had brought only a single lantern, which he hung on the bow, its weak light shimmering across the ripples made by the boat's slow movement. Around mid-morning, the sound of his paddles faded as he drifted near the far end of the lake, where old trees leaned toward the water. From that distance, no one in the village could see him. The forest there grew thick and dark, its reflection spreading like ink beneath the pale sky. The man steadied himself, preparing to reel in the morning catch. The surface beneath him looked calm, yet the water near the stern began to pulse in small circles, as though disturbed by something below. He paused, leaning closer, thinking it might be trapped fish rising for air. The motion grew stronger. A dull scrape echoed under the hull, followed by another, deeper, dragging sound that shook the boat's frame. Mikhail lifted the lantern, peering into the water. Nothing moved beneath, but the sound came again, this time from the opposite side, closer to his feet. The entire vessel rocked once, then again, harder. He reached for the oars but lost balance as something heavy struck underneath, leaving long, shallow scratches that split the wooden grain. Each blow carried enough force to push the boat sideways, tilting it toward the lake's center. The ripples widened, and a shape surfaced near the edge of the fog. It was tall and dark, rising above the reflection like a pillar of shadow, the outline of thick arms just visible before the mist swallowed them. A chill spread across the water, flattening every ripple. The lantern flame flickered and went out. In the next instant, silence filled the air. Not even the echo of the impact remained. The lake regained its stillness, empty once more beneath the clouded sky. When rangers arrived 3 days later, the missing fisherman's small craft was spotted adrift near the northern shore. From a distance, it seemed abandoned, moving slowly with the current toward a line of reeds. They rowed closer, calling out, but the quiet swallowed every sound before it reached the opposite bank. The scene ahead was not what they expected to find. The rangers reached the drifting vessel and hooked its side to pull it closer. The water around it was calm, no wind to guide the motion, only the faint sound of their own paddles breaking the still surface. As the small craft touched the bank, they realized the shape slumped within was not empty gear. A man lay forward across the seat, his arms hanging loosely at his sides. His cap floated near the bow, caught against the splintered edge. It was Mikhail Ivanov, the missing fisherman from the nearby village. His skin was pale from the cold, his clothing torn, but without signs of struggle. What drew their eyes next were the deep grooves along the wooden sides of the boat, as though something with enormous weight had pressed and scraped across it from below. There were no rocks in that section of the lake, no hidden reef or log that could cause such damage. The oars stood upright in the water on either side, balanced perfectly, their handles locked between the benches. They seemed to have been placed there rather than dropped. The reflection of the blades shimmered just beneath the surface, unbroken by movement. For several minutes the men waited, half expecting some current to disturb the pattern, but the lake remained motionless. Not even the sound of a bird passed overhead. They towed the craft toward the pier at the southern end, where the shoreline widened into a gentle curve of sand. Upon stepping onto the ground, They saw the marks that continued from the water's edge. Footprints, enormous and bare, stretched in a straight line from the tree line down into the shallows. Each impression sank several inches deep, elongated and wider than any normal track. Water still pooled inside them, reflecting the gray sky above. Trees near the path leaned outward, as though forced apart. Branches had snapped high above human reach, twisted away from the trunk. The smell of damp earth filled the air, mixed with a faint metallic scent. It was clear that something massive had moved between the forest and the lake, and that it had not come from any known animal. They carried the body to the village, reporting what they saw. Officials later examined the scene, but offered only plain explanations. The scratches were said to be from ice or driftwood, the prints dismissed as deformed impressions from sliding soil. The matter was closed quickly. Yet word spread among the locals, who knew the water better than any map could show. They began avoiding the area after dusk. Fishermen changed their routes to smaller ponds and rivers, never venturing to the northern bank again. Weeks later, travelers passing through claimed to hear faint sounds from across the lake just before sunset. A soft creaking noise echoed over the water, steady and rhythmic, like oars moving through stillness. But when anyone looked toward the far side, there was only empty reflection and mist. Some said the boat continued to appear at times, gliding slowly without a hand to steer, returning again and again to the same silent shore. On October 3, 2021, a four-person patrol moved through the upper reaches of Yukon Territory, where few people traveled that late in the season. The lead was Samuel Briggs, a 40-year-old supervisor with nearly 2 decades of field experience. Alongside him were Lena Hale, a 33-year-old wildlife specialist, Robert Field, a tracker skilled in navigation, and Aaron Dole, the youngest at 27, newly transferred from another district. Their assignment was routine, surveying storm damage along an old service trail and logging evidence of poaching traps before the first snow. The range stretched across miles of forested ridges and narrow valleys, its tall pines crowding over winding creeks that glimmered faintly beneath morning frost. The group left the ranger station before sunrise, expecting to return by evening. By noon, wind swept across the slope, carrying a chill that bit through their uniforms. They paused near a clearing where old-growth trees leaned over a meadow ringed by sharp ridges. Samuel radioed their position but received only static. The air felt unnaturally still, even the usual bird calls missing. The forest seemed to listen. They decided to press on, following a game path that descended toward a shallow ravine. The farther they went, the quieter it became. Even their footsteps seemed muted, swallowed by damp soil. Robert pointed to the ground where fresh impressions marked the mud beside a fallen trunk. The shape was strange, broad and long, almost human but far larger, the edges sharp as if pressed by great weight. They measured nearly twice the span of a man's boot. Each step was spaced evenly, crossing from one side of the ravine to the other. None of them could explain it. Lena photographed the marks, but moments later, the faint hum of wind shifted through the pines, though the branches above did not sway. A low vibration seemed to rise from the ground, subtle yet steady, like a heartbeat moving through the soil. The group exchanged uneasy glances. Samuel ordered them to continue, but the air thickened with an odor of damp earth and musk, growing stronger as they reached the meadow beyond the trees. The sunlight dimmed, filtered by clouds that gathered too quickly to be natural. Aaron stopped suddenly, staring at the tree line ahead. For an instant, something moved between the trunk, tall, dark, and shapeless, gliding rather than walking. Then the movement ceased, leaving only swaying pine tops and deep silence. A rustling swept through the grass as if a gust of wind had passed, though none of them felt air touch their faces. The smell deepened, heavy and cloying. Lena clutched her pack as the sound of snapping wood echoed from behind, followed by a thud that made the ground tremble. Trees along the ridge cracked at unnatural heights, their trunks bending as if pushed by an unseen force. Panic surged through them, but before anyone could speak, the noise cut off completely. The meadow fell silent again, cold and heavy, and all that remained was the faint echo of breath that did not belong to any of them. The silence after the last sound felt alive, pressing against their skin as if the forest itself breathed. The air grew colder within minutes, and thin fog began curling across the grass in slow ribbons. Samuel motioned for the group to retreat toward higher ground, but their footing slipped on wet soil. The mist thickened until the far edge of the meadow disappeared entirely. A dull pulse seemed to travel through the ground again, steady and rhythmic, as though following them wherever they moved. Robert stumbled, catching himself on a fallen trunk marked with deep gouges that cut through the bark. The scratches were angled and wide, higher than a human arm could reach. The smell of sap mixed with that strange musky odor rising from the trees. Every sound in the forest had vanished, leaving only their unsteady breathing and the soft squelch of mud beneath bare root. Lena turned back to check the tree line and froze. Through the fog, faint movement stirred between the trunk. Something shifted there, slow and deliberate, keeping equal pace with their step. No outline showed clearly, only the suggestion of a tall form sliding from one pine to another, never breaking the rhythm of the distant vibration underfoot. Fear grew heavier than exhaustion. The group broke formation, half stumbling, half running toward the ridge they had descended hours earlier. The haze swallowed the last of the daylight, turning the entire valley into a dim gray hollow. As they climbed, a sound like air being drawn through narrow lungs moved behind them, long and steady, following until the noise faded into nothing. Searchers later said the patrol's radio beacon had gone silent soon after their last logged position. For 2 days there was no trace, only the signal from the truck still parked near the service road. When rescue teams finally located them on the third morning, the four were found in a wide clearing north of the ridge. None wore boots. Their footwear lay in a neat pile 10 feet away, perfectly aligned. Their clothing was caked in dried earth, sleeves torn and collars stretched, though no cuts marked their skin. They moved slowly across the meadow in a straight line, eyes glassy and unfocused, heads tilted upward as if straining to listen. Their steps matched, each rising and falling at the same moment, barefoot in cold dew. When reached by medics, they spoke little and resisted guidance. Only one voice carried through the still air, murmuring about something unseen among the trees, about movement that flowed like air itself. After recovery, none could recall how they reached that place or why their boots had been removed. Medical checks found no chemical exposure, no head injury, no evidence of trauma. Weeks later, investigators returned to study the site. The deep impressions once found in the mud had disappeared, washed away by rain. Yet the tall pines surrounding the area still bore strange indentations halfway up their trunk, as if immense weight had pressed against them and then quietly moved on.